This video is going to focus on the meninges of the brain, as well as the venous sinuses and the dural reflections that form those sinuses. This will also fill you in as to how the cerebrospinal fluid that is produced by the choroid plexus of the ventricles of the brain, which are the internal spaces, how that CSF that is continuously made is also continuously drained. What you see before you is a human brain, and what you see covering the brain is the thickest, most outermost covering called the dura mater, and when translated it means tough mother. Now the dura mater, I'm not sure if you can appreciate this or not, but along the longitudinal fissure and the transverse fissures, the dura mater is going to want to creep into those spaces. The dura mater is actually two layers. There's a periosteal layer, which is what you see here, which was peeled right off of the skull. And when you look on the inside of a skull cap area, here's one here, is that you can see all of these crevices. Those crevices are formed by these blood vessels that are running on the dura mater itself. The deepest layer of the dura mater is called the meningeal layer, and the meningeal layer is the one that likes to creep into the spaces when it can. We do know already, based on our study of the brain, is that if this is the brain sitting in the cranial cavity, here is the longitudinal fissure, and the dura mater is going to want to creep right inside. And when it does that, it is called a dural reflection. And the dural reflection that is going to be found in the longitudinal fissure, if I take the brain out, and you see this piece of dura mater that is going to be between the two cerebral hemispheres, this is called falx cerebri. What stops falx cerebri from going all the way through is corpus callosum. Remember, corpus callosum is going to be groups of axon tracts that are going to connect the right and left cerebral hemispheres. When I turn this back to its anatomical position, you notice that this dura mater also has a set of lateral wings, really. If I take the other half of the cerebral hemisphere out, we're going to have a set of wings, more dural reflections, and these dural reflections are going to be found within the transverse fissure. Remember, that is the space between the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum. This dural reflection is called tentorium cerebelli. It acts as a tent over the cerebellum. The cerebellum, when you look at its structure, has a bit of an indentation posteriorly. Dura mater is going to try and fill in that gap. And so that dural reflection then would be found right here, and that is called falx cerebelli. Please note the difference between falx cerebri here, between the cerebral hemispheres, and falx cerebelli, between the two hemispheres of the cerebellum, are spelled rather similarly. No forgiveness will be given for a misspelling of those two structures, so please be careful. What I want you to now recognize about these dural reflections is that if you are going to have two layers of dura mater, a meningeal and a periosteal. If this paper towel represents my meningeal layer, oops, this is actually better live, but we'll do our best. If this layer represents our meningeal layer, our one that's going to go down into the spaces, right, and then lay over the brain. And then we have a periosteal layer on top. Do you see how there is going to be, a gap that potentially forms? It's almost like a triangular gap right there. And that is called a venous sinus. And so when we see those structures in blue on this model, this blue right here is a venous sinus with the name of superior sagittal sinus. This is the inferior sagittal sinus. The superior sagittal sinus is going to come all the way around, continues here. Yes? And then from here, it is going to split. And that blood and cerebrospinal fluid together will then go through the transverse sinuses. What forms the transverse sinuses? Tentorium cerebelli. And when you follow transverse sinuses around, you see that it kind of swoops down to jugular foramen. This swooping down from here, from the split to the nerves is called the sigmoid sinus. Are there other sinuses in here? Sure, all these blue things you see have names. And if you feel cheated out of your education because I didn't hold you accountable for them, I apologize. But transverse sinus, sigmoid sinus. What is interesting is that if you look at our skulls, here is the posterior cranial fossa. This is where the cerebellar hemispheres would sit. You see an indentation right here. This indentation would be the transverse sinuses. And then you see this swooping down to jugular foramen. This would represent the location of the sigmoid sinus. And so you can, what would be the question? The question is, what came first? The sinuses or the bone? The sinuses came first. The dura mater came first. The brain came first. And then the bone formed around it. Okay. Going back to our human specimen, here's the dura mater. I'm going to lift the brain. And I can see this dura mater, although I cut this here on accident. And I can see when I lift it, here's the cerebrum, here's the cerebellum, which means this is transverse fissure. And if that's transverse fissure, if I tug on this dura, I will see the meningeal layer that is creeping within. And so this would be tentorium cerebelli. If I come up here and I peel the dura out of the longitudinal fissure, I'm going to see, just C3, I'm going to see a chunk of dura, a dural reflection, called falx cerebri. So I pull all that out, and it looks like a swim cap, really. But with that swim cap, and I open it up, try and open it up, is that I will see falx cerebri separating the two cerebral hemispheres, and then I will see my wings, tentorium cerebelli, that's going to be found within the the transverse fissure. Okay. You see that hole there? And that hole exists because that meningeal layer of dura creeps into the longitudinal fissure, and the periosteal layer stays against the bone, and there's that little gap in between. And that gap, being the venous sinus, because of its location, is called the superior sagittal sinus. Along the inferior margin would be the inferior sagittal sinus. And that's the dura and the dural reflections. The deepest and most delicate meninge is the pia mater, and you can see that the pia mater has actually been torn here, but this would be the pia mater directly on the cerebral cortex itself. The arachnoid mater is found between the dura mater and the pia mater, but it's usually lost in the, well, it's usually if it disintegrated by the time we get to it in a dissection. But it's called arachnoid because it has a webby type of consistency, which again we would lose when we take it out. So pia mater, the most delicate, on the gray matter of the brain itself. Arachnoid mater would be superficial to it, and then your dura mater, your tough mother, is superficial. It has two layers, periosteal layer making contact with the skull, the meningeal layer, the one that will touch the other meninges, but it is that layer that then creeps into our empty spaces called dural reflections. There's your meninges and your venous sinuses. Thank you for watching, and I hope it was helpful.